Hello, and welcome to the third of the two historians. And this week we're joined by someone who's a bit of a different historian in a way. I would put Glynn definitely in what I call the passion historian scenario, in that he has a lot of passion for history and he really does love it. But of course, he's a science fiction author. But the thing is, as you'll soon learn when you start hearing him talk about this topic today, which the topic is how do you create fleets in science fiction? How do you put them together? History is wedded into his fiction. Not in the scenario of him trying to interpret past battles and put them into his events and his books, but rather in him trying to capture the realities of being human in situations like that, and trying to use that information to give his books a realism which I have to say I really do enjoy. I really do enjoy his books. He was always going to be part of the series. If I did 3 episodes, he'd be in it. If I did 10 episodes, he'd be in it. If I did 1 or 2 episodes, he would have been in it. Because Glynn is just the nicest person you will ever meet. And frankly, abducting him in Canada was one of the best things the shipshape crew could do. It gave us an excellent companion for many of the days in Canada. We literally did abduct him. Don't worry, he was willingly abducted. But yeah, he was abducted. He was expected to just say hi to us and treat us to dinner, and we basically kidnapped him the next day. We turned up and said, "Do you want to come with us?" And he got in the car, so we were off. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you enjoyed the chat, and I hope you found it as interesting to chat with him and hear the conversation with him as I did. It was a wonderful time.
Now, I have to say, I'm going back to recording on the computer and onto my computer rather than recording it to the cloud, because when I recorded to the cloud, and this is for everyone who's watching Two Historians, it did the whole image of jump, jump, jump between the images thing, and it had a weird sound thing. So I'm not doing that. But this time, this is the third episode of Two Historians, and I'm joined not by a historian, but I am joined by a historian because, let's be honest, Glynn is one of the most passionate people I know when it comes to history and going and studying and learning history. So much so, he's talking about coming and joining the shipshape crew in Japan next year on his own money, on his own bank balance, just to come, see what we're doing and enjoy the history. Because of course, we famously abducted you when we were in Canada.
Yes, you did.
And we took you to America.
And I got you safely back across the border.
Yeah,
by being very sad, sick, and pathetic in the back seat.
It was very important that it was 4 Brits and a Canadian were crossing the border. The American border guards made sure they were very careful to make sure we weren't carrying any muskets. They were very sure of that. But the reason I have Glynn on here is because one of the questions we often sort of talk about in history is, building fleets and what ships we're going to add into a fleet, what sort of formations, especially in war studies, and when we're looking at procurement today and we're debating these things. But of course, Glynn has both the ultimate fun and the ultimate problem. He's a science fiction author. He invents not just fleets, but universes, and fleets which fit those universes, and has to decide whether he's going to make a fleet which is an old fleet which doesn't fit the missions it's going to do, and then the people are going to have to probably rise up and sort of manage it somehow, or is he going to fit a fleet which does fit the mission they've got to do, but the people don't? Because in my experience, that's usually the 2 ways of making the story interesting. Either the people don't fit the mission, or the ship doesn't fit the mission. Enterprise, the Star Trek was the classic one of the ship never seemed to fit the mission. It was the best ship in the frigating universe, the Galaxy class especially were a good example of this. Mm-hmm. And yet every single mission, oh no, this is something only our people can work out. And you sort of go,
no, it was designed to be, from what I could tell, the Galaxy class was designed to be a 3/4 solution to any problem.
Yes.
Which means it ends up being about 50% solution to any given problem.
Pretty much. But no, please introduce yourself. And also, give us I better ask this again. How many books have you written and published now? Because every time we talk, it goes up.
I just finished, I think it is my 81st written novel. It'll be my 80th published when it comes out in March. So... Because
They-
there is, you know, the first novel I ever wrote, which if you haven't already seen it, you never will.
I'm going to have to try and track this down somehow. I'm going
You
to have to try
can't.
and track this. You want to
It
bet?
doesn't exist. It was never published. A few people got access to, a few people were sent copies of it at various points, including Jim Bain, which should give you an idea of how long ago this was.
Mhm.
But, you know, no, it was a, in hindsight, rather bad pastiche of David Weber's Starfire and Alternate Roman Empire.
We
It's
all have
actually
to
a really
start somewhere.
interesting method of interstellar travel that I might use again. But that's neither here nor there.
We all have to start somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What the second
But
book I ever wrote
no.
was published for a while, but it was I got told it was a bad book too many times, so we took it down.
See, that's the problem. The old rule, and it was told this by a professor many years ago, and the same professor has now told it to me 3 times in a row over the last few years, is you've not really achieved anything until people are telling you what you've done is terrible.
That was the difference between I get that. I get the what you've done is terrible and everything. Um, but that one there was enough backing evidence that it was we eventually decided that there was a concern that people who were reading through the catalog would hit that and just stop reading because it was sufficiently out of tone with everything else for my skill level. So we took it down and it wasn't selling enough for that to be a problem.
Okay. Understandable.
It
But
is, as
yeah,
I understand, at least one person's, you know, favorite book, but they have a copy, so power to them.
that's good.
But they were also one of
So,
my mom's friends, so you know.
in which case, it's kind of nice they like the book.
Or they're
It's kind of
just, you
nice.
know,
Yeah.
buttering up my mom.
So here's the question. How do you go about this? Because one of the things I love about your books is your books have a varied amount of fleets in them. It depends on the science fiction, but almost every time it seems to be different power sources, different methods of star travel, and the fleets are different. So every time you're inventing whole new fleets, and you sometimes pick weapon systems which, frankly, I look at and go, "Okay, Glynn, this could work in this setting, but oh my lord."
Is that the
I
beams
wouldn't
of
want to
pure
rely on it.
antimatter or the tendency for for gigaton range nuclear antimatter warheads?
Um, both can cause me some worry sometimes. You do
The
like
point
the mathematically expansive nuclear warheads.
usually antimatter.
Yeah,
Yeah. I don't generally have nuclear warheads that are more than a few hundred megatons.
only a few hundred megatons. They work it though. They work it though. And it's sort of course, my favorite book, which everyone knows pretty much, is your Battle Cruiser series, as I tend to
Yeah.
refer to it, because it's all set around battle cruisers and using them in space. And the fact is, they do make sort of sense to space because the battle cruisers, they carry a small fighter complement,
Yep.
they carry troops. They carry enough firepower they can pretty much stand in battle against almost anything that they're going to come
Yep.
across, but also fast enough and long legged enough, cruisery enough that they can do this sort of distant patrol on their own.
They
And it makes sense to me.
Yeah. And the battle cruisers in the Peacekeepers of Soul setting are
Yeah.
more German style than British because they've got more arm because of the nature of their defenses. They end up with more defense than they're basically cruiser
They are
speed with battleship grade defenses.
they are battle cruisers rather than battle cruisers. They are
Yeah.
one word battle cruisers, not two word. And I'm not going to use this video to talk again about the whole spectrum and on the dreadnoughts.
But the
I
one
speak about them
thing
so many videos, it's disturbing.
the thing I found fascinating was when I hit the very end of the series and you're dealing with the Turzan's primary capital ships that are basically generally considered relatively correctly the most dangerous things in the galaxy. And by the standard the Terrans use, they're battle cruisers because they are gravity shielded ships intended for long range operations built around a primary weapon intended to take out anything it fights. They are, by the criteria the main series guys use, the Turzan's Star Blades, I think, are battle cruisers.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that series has now come to an end, but I had fun writing it.
It was fun in the first book when they were at a diplomatic meeting and there were quite a lot of people, even on the bridge, when you're describing how they were surprised that what the symbols were showing up as they were scanning the ships and scanning the Terran ship as they were approaching. And it was what I loved about it was it was such a great scene of world building from the ship's perspective, because also it built the Navy in that it showed that this is a proper Navy. You're not not all information is shared amongst everyone on every ship. There are going to be people who are quite senior on an individual ship going, I've never realized they had that. And the captain's basically going, yeah.
Yep. Why is there a code on that ship saying that one destroyer-sized vessel is the most dangerous ship in this system? This is why.
It is. And it's the interesting thing to me that you always include that in your settings. And again, it's one of the things I like about there is quite a lot of science fiction I sometimes read is always the big ships are powerful because of their size. And you sometimes flip that around because that's also kind of like the reality. As we talked about with history, torpedo boats sometimes are the most powerful ships on the field, on the water, if it's the right circumstance.
And because of the starting question was, how do I do it? And the answer is, I was trying to pull up a songified version of this quote before, but it's the Carl Sagan quote of, if you wish to make an apple pie, you have to create the universe. Yeah. And the fleet is inextricably built into the world that exists. As you say, it's like the technology all feeds into it. Like the technology that the fleet is using is also the technology that the civilians are using. It's like there might be a difference between how fast a warship moves interstellar and how fast a freighter moves interstellar, though I can't think of very many circumstances where you will have no civilian ships capable of moving as fast as military ships. But I could definitely think of circumstances where your average civilian ship is slower than your average military ship over distance. But it all boils down to how I built the setting and what pieces feed together, and all of that always comes down to usually the themes of the story I'm trying to tell and the setting I'm trying to build. So it ends up being, if I want a setting where the star systems are more separate and more independent, then the star drives that are available to them are much slower. And interstellar communication is limited to ships and these sorts of things. And it all feeds together. And then, as we were just saying, like, everything is about the fleets have purposes. They're not just existing in isolation. It's like, what was this fleet designed to do? What was it designed to fight? But fight isn't combat is not necessarily the primary role of a fleet. If a fleet's built for a society that has never seen conflict or has not seen conflict in a long time, then its fleet is built for anti-piracy and patrol and disaster relief. That shows up a bunch in my Starships Mage series, where the Royal Martian Navy when they finally hit a war in the later part of the series, they're able to fight it, but they're really not bringing a fleet that's designed for war. They're bringing a fleet that's designed at its base level for anti-piracy and security operations, and whose heavier warships are basically designed off pure theory. They've got battleships and cruisers, but they've never matched them against a comparable opponent outside of exercises. And a couple of, very bad days. In terms of discipline, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, that's a very realistic scenario to me. Again, it's sort of, you're going to have this, we get it in history as well, the exact example is the Victorian Royal Navy, which for quite a lot of its period didn't have any wars to fight, had no one it was going to fight. It was going around the world being the world policeman, but it was not going around the world going, oh, we're going to have a fight. And you start to build a very different fleet and a very different, not just ships, but also the personnel are different, because it's a mindset difference between fighting wars and doing the duties in peacetime.
Yeah.
In war,
The other
you know, in
one,
peacetime, you have to be very careful about when you're going to fire, whether you fire or
yes.
not. You know, you have to. For in wartime, hesitating to fire can mean your own death and the death of your crew.
Yeah. The other example is the prequel novella for Peacekeepers of Seoul, where you very much run into a peacetime fleet, where you have the Commonwealth Space Force squadron in that book that is explicitly a dog and pony show.
Mm.
Their purpose is not to actually do anything except be a tech demonstration to sell British technology to any people who might want to buy it. And then it's when things go very seriously wrong, it's what happens then when that tech demo squadron ends up being the people in the middle of, well, the beginning of the biggest human on human war in the setting's history.
What I liked about that was you showed the fact that there are still, even in that sort of scenario, there are going to be a lot of people who take their job very seriously and take
Yes.
pride in it. The fact there are going to be some who don't, but there are going to be some who really do. And that prequel, by the way, if you haven't read that, if anyone's listening to this and haven't read it, go read it. It's a really interesting story in that, again, with the fleet, the way the ships have been designed, the way they're operating, someone has been worked hard on those ships behind the scenes, that whilst they were going to be a dog and pony show, they're also going to still be able to work.
Because the point was to sell them to people who needed them to work. But again,
Yeah.
you run into they are theory horses.
Mm.
And so they have definite shortcomings, but they have a lot of theory and a lot of history to draw on to build those ships.
Yeah, and they do you make that that's the other thing, you write it very realistically in terms of how the ships are going. Your ships, they're never perfect. They're always very much practical, not perfection.
Yeah.
And I that's, to me, a very realistic approach to ships, because again, it's always the interesting part of them when you sort of look at the Andromeda series and the Firefly series and all the big science fictions which have been on TV. It always worries me when the ships seem to be being shown as being perfect and showing as it is, and you sit there and go, well, they're not. They can't be. You know, the problem with the Glorious Heritage class, because I did a whole video about that years ago on this channel, was that they were just so costly to build.
Yeah.
They never had enough of them.
I mean, the Andromeda suffers from a very severe problem with the sense of scale in general.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yes, there is a huge problem of scale in the Andromeda series, but we were just, there's a huge problem of scale. It's like when it's like when you start looking at the VLS cells in Stargate on the Daedalus class, and you're going, why do you have so few missiles on this ship? And once you're in space, you only need to fire to maneuver the motors. You don't need the fuel to, because once you've got up to speed, you're just going to keep accelerating because you're not running into friction. So you. Okay.
There's an argument for continual acceleration to maintain if you lack artificial gravity, which I don't believe this class did.
No, and the missiles shouldn't be. We would hope a missile's internal systems would not be affected by a lack of gravity.
Well, the thing with missiles, the question always boils down to: can you turn the engine off and on again? Because you definitely want your missile to be actively maneuvering when it's in terminal acquisition.
Yeah.
So if your engine isn't something you can turn off, and that's not an unreasonable postulation. I don't know enough about modern missiles, I will freely admit that, to assess whether it's something that they can really do. I don't think so. But if your engine can't turn off, then you're effectively going to measure the range of your missile in how long is it under power? Is it flying powered? Because once it no longer has powered flight, it's a sitting duck when it hits your terminal defenses. Assuming your terminal defenses can actually pick up an unpowered missile, which if they can't, you need to design a better ship.
you need to have a conversation with your weapon sensors.
Yeah. But that's, where you come into things, and it's like, because that is also part of the factor when I'm designing fleets and ships and so forth is what are the defenses that are available? Do they have, fancy energy shields? Or as in one setting I'm working in right now, is energy screen a generic term for a whole bunch of different systems that ranges from what is effectively a Star Trek deflector shield to jammers and electronic warfare that all just gets lumped into the one energy screen. It's not just one system. It's about 15. But outside of very specific uses, even the characters are just going to call it the energy screen.
Because it
And
is.
that factors it.
Yeah.
And then
in terms of people talking, let's be honest, even when we're talking about today, when we talk about systems, we tend to lump them together in various categories. We don't talk about the minutiae categories until we're having a really in-depth debate, do we?
No. Because if you're trying to talk to me about stuff, I know more than the layman, but I'm not going to go down into various what are the turbine measurements. I don't understand enough to tell. I could barely follow the difference between a gas turbine and a steam turbine.
One is a lot more efficient than the other.
Yeah. And it's not entirely inaccurate to say that my interest in history begins when they started putting my interest in naval history begins when they started putting steam engines in ships and ends when they started putting missiles on them.
I do notice. Although saying that, you do write some science fiction where your spaceships have sails.
I think so. Usually that's a background thing because there's often solar sail ships as civilian vessels in a bunch of the settings. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's always sort of something I look at and go. Because
in terms of intra-system transport, solar sails are ridiculously efficient. They're also ridiculously slow. But, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're accelerating at 1/4 meter per second squared and you're always accelerating at that gets you where you're going faster than accelerating at 3 gravities for a day.
Well,
that's one of I have done the calculations at one point for solar sail transit from Earth to Mars and back. It's efficient. I don't remember what the numbers came out at anymore. It's been so long, but it's interesting when you do things like that because the science is there. We don't currently have. We're in an interesting place with the science right now because we've got a lot of theoretical concepts that our science and our knowledge and our math say should work, but our materials science and our engineering is maybe halfway there. And our ability to get something that could actually practically test it into orbit is effectively zero. It's like, we are pretty sure we could rig up a nuclear rocket of like 4 different varieties that I could think of, 2 off the top of my head, and a couple more complicated versions, basically, of the other 2. But we are not using anything that's firing radiation out its ass to get off the planet.
No.
It's a very bad idea. We like this planet. It's the place where we keep our stuff.
Yeah, the thing I usually tend to point out is people is like Trazon in Warhammer 40k who likes to collect things. He doesn't like people to come touch his stuff, and he doesn't believe in damaging his own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same. You treat your planet like it's a bit of a precious jewel. Look after it.
Right now,
yes, it's got a lot of resources. Yeah, there's a lot of resources we got, and a lot of things there, and it is good. I am fully supportive of going exploring other places and finding other places and going something because I think it'd be just fun. Honestly, this is the big. I know it's going to be hard. I know it's going to be difficult. I know it's not going to be nice and it going to Mars, especially for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 generations.
We do not do this because it is easy. We do it because it's difficult, because it challenges us. I started with a quote from, I think, Robert Kennedy and then went off on my own there.
No, but that's the thing. Sometimes it's good to do things because they challenge you. because you can't become any better. You can't achieve any more of yourself unless you do challenge yourself. It's how you grow as a human being and how you grow as a civilization.
Yep.
Which actually does bring us back to the fleets, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the interesting question. I think for me is often is looking at the ships with your fleets and the structure you sort of going on. You have to design not only the setting, not only decide what power they're going to have, weapons, but also you have to work out a naming strategy for your ships. You have to work out a crewing strategy. You have to work out a rank strategy. You have to work out what they're going to be. These all
Mhm.
these things in the background, and then you have to keep it straight in your head for multiple books. My man, how big are the Excel spreadsheets?
Not as big as you might think. Some of them can be pretty grotesque. Like the final one, part of it is that a lot of it doesn't lives in like there's some Excel spreadsheets that just carry on. I'm starting to get into the habit of I just have an Excel spreadsheet that carries on for an entire series, and some of those are getting kind of grotesque. And then there are just folders of Word documents and mixed Excel files, and sometimes the Excel files get redone when I've decided new ways to calculate things to come back to the same points. But yeah, there's a lot of Excel files floating around on my computer. You're right.
And how do you decide what you're going to do with the sort of the naming scheme as well? Where does that come from? Do you just go, I fancy this name, or do you go and look up specific names? Or you sort of work out going, okay, they're going to be using this because this naming scheme fits with their culture and these sort of things?
So it often starts with a general, so a lot of stuff in the setting, in my various stuff starts with a general sense of trying to pin down who or what a culture is. How does this culture function? What is its economy? What is its logistics? What's sort of your narrow culture, individual system
Well,
that we're talking about? What's sort of the broad culture of humanity? Funnily enough, it works much the same for Mighty Fantasy. But it is you have to understand the culture, and that means you have to understand their economics and a lot of their history, and none of it in great detail. Like all of what I'm talking about here is very, very broad strokes, very broad brushstrokes. I don't generally delve down into detail until I need it. Some of those details take shape as I'm doing the broad strokes and either get noted down or just live in my head until they're needed. But often details only come out when I are only really get constructed when I need them. But because I have that framework, they fit in that framework, and so they're all relatively consistent. One of the points I've made a few times to people over the years is remember that if you are looking at a culture in one of my books and it's very, very German, the Brissinger Kaiserreich in the Scattered Stars books, for example, they're not German. Do not for one second think that they are actually German. What you're looking at is a planet whose colonizing founders were cosplaying Imperial Germany. And partly that's an excuse for me to get away to cover my mistakes when I screw shit up. When I screw things up. But it's also what I kind of see happening. So when you have these colonies, and a lot of them are going to be founded by really charismatic people or groups of people who have a vision in their brain of a perfect society. That they've got a bunch of other people to sign on for to come join the colony or to fund the colony. And some of those people are just trying to leave where they are, but a lot of them will bought into this vision. And so they're settling on a planet based on this vision of a perfect society, which is almost certainly going to be, for propaganda reasons, filtered through some great era of the past, whichever that happens to be. So you end up with, in Brissinger, it's the early post-unification Germany through World War I, Imperial Germany. Very short era to really call a golden era of any kind. But you also, in the same setting, you have Apollo, which is explicitly based off Greek democracy. And Greek democracy is not democracy as we would regard it today. It's basically a codified oligopoly or oligocracy. It's a democracy of the wealthy.
Yes.
So Apollo has that as kind of their primary system. And much like several of the Greek democracies, they talk a good game about their pacifism and not wanting to go to war, while being militarily dominant over their neighbors, majorly so.
Yes.
And so you have that structure there. And again, like that
So
culture
basically,
influence.
can I just
Hmm?
add in? So you are adding credence to the meme that is that the reason they all speak English in Star Wars is because it was established that universe was established by the British Empire, or other people cosplaying as the British Empire, and that's the
That
reason
would
they all speak
basically
English.
be how, to a large extent, right now, a lot of my stuff is postulated on the theory that most people going to space are going to speak English because that's currently the operating language of science.
Mhm.
That may change over the next 100, 200, 500 years, obviously, but there's a limit to what I can project, and it's easier for me to write it in English.
Yes, that is a ultimately that is the thing.
Yeah.
It's easier.
So I work in universes where English is the default language because it was the default language of the people putting together the ships and running the diaspora.
Mhm.
There are other languages in play, but an English that has mostly been stabilized by the presence of media is the lingua franca, the default language of interstellar society in my settings. Where it isn't, I'm not telling the reader because that's just going to confuse people.
Mhm.
One of the things I was poking at with the setting I'm building this week was it's actually very, in many ways, the leadership of the group that's in control of space travel is very Spanish. And it was like, do they actually speak Spanish? No. So you end up with the officers on the ship have a whole mix of last names, but a whole bunch of very Spanish first names. Because regardless of their ethnicity, there is a certain degree of Spanish names and Spanish, not necessarily language, but fashionings are quite popular in the leadership of the company because it was founded by a Spaniard who decided to go to flip off the world basically and do his own thing.
I can understand that. I can see that happening. Knowing the Spanish people I do, I could see one of them doing that quite happily.
Yep. So you have the main character of the book is Cirilo Webster. Very Spanish first name, very English last name. And that's
So
kind
yeah,
of
might as well. It's sort of it's fun to have that sort of scenario going on.
yeah. And it's building the complicated scenarios where stories just start falling out. Like any setting I'm building, I'm starting from a concept of the story I want to tell.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff gets set up to create that story. But that only really works for about either the very high arc or the first book. And then after that, it ends up being what does that first book or first arc leave as loose strings? What does this construct, this universe, these characters that I have put together over those first books that were originally conceived, what stories clearly follow on from the loose threads and so forth that I've left hanging? It's like the Castle Federation setting was very, very, very much set up to provide a justification for starfighters, despite the fact that there's a good deal of argument that for most cases where you would send a starfighter, you're better off sending a missile. But in that setting, there was a very clear economic justification for the purpose of starfighters. Because of the sheer cost of building the faster than light drives, the Alcubierre Stetson drives in the system, in the setting, there was only one size you would build a starship, the biggest you possibly could, because your star drive's half the cost or more. Adding 10% to the size of the ship isn't really a problem, as long as your drive can actually expand to that size. But you end up with a ship that is absolutely huge and costs 10% of a wealthy star system's GDP to build, and a couple of percent of the same star system's GDP to maintain every year. So you have relatively small fleets of powerful but very, very expensive ships that are critically fragile to the weapons people have to play with. Again, work back to those antimatter warheads and beams that bother Alex.
It don't bother me. It's just a case of, oh my lord.
Castle Federation is very much an eggshells armed with hammers universe.
Yes.
So the starfighter was the answer to that from an economics perspective, because expensive as those starfighters were and difficult as it was to find, and the pilots are only about 2% of the population actually have the ability to be a starfighter pilot, and the starfighters are not cheap. But compared to the cost of a starship, they're nothing. And so they get deployed and sent out to try and take out the other guy's starships without risking yours. Because if you lose your fighter group, you could just jump out and you're fine. But if your fighter group manages to take out the enemy capital ship, well, you've won without even risking your capital ship. The reality, of course, is far more complicated, as you easily see if you're going through. If you read the books, there's a lot of battle line on battle line conflict in there, despite their attempts to avoid it.
I would honestly say also, even with those being the criteria, I still think, at least one of the navies was very, very badly constructed for what it needed to do.
Several of them were.
Hmm?
Several of them were.
Well, no, the Castles Federation's one to me made sense. The Kota Confederacy did make sense for them.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say the Earth Force,
there were
several gaps, big gaps in that force structure for what they needed to do.
Well, one of the things
I could see in the setting why they wouldn't have them filled.
Mm-hmm.
But it was me sitting there going, oh, I think Glynn in this setting has also deleted the naval historians, because otherwise there'd be at least a group of people like me with chairs whacking some generals around the back of the head.
I believe in that one, canonically, there was they tried to pull a fast one over the assembly by saying, if we do this, the ships will be cheaper and we can mass produce them, which was a lie. And they ended up with a large number of ships that were barely sufficient for the time they were built, and then ran into a government that was basically saying, but your hull numbers are fine. Everyone says that, the hull numbers are all that matters, right? For years afterward.
Yeah.
It was explicitly what happened with the Commonwealth Navy and why they had a slew of older ships that weren't really up to the weight of battle of the war they were fighting. But the other problem they ran into was it wasn't the Terrans who first deployed starfighters. So they suffered from a very strong thing of not developed around here, even with what had become one of the primary weapon systems at the time.
Yes.
So they had far fewer carriers as a ratio than most of the other fleets in play.
Although I would also say there's also part of me which was looking at that setting and was wondering why, well, seeing as you're taking all these starfighters, etc., what about taking a sort of Defiant, as in USS Defiant size ship from Star Trek? Having some ships along that side, attached onto the side of your hull to go out as extra additions. Because, these carriers needed escorts, to my mind. They needed something else to help them defend against fighter attacks.
So you see those as guard ships, and the basic theory that I used when I was setting it up was, that they could deploy starfighters more efficiently than they could deploy those. So having using some of their starfighters for escort made more sense than giving up a third of their starfighters for one escort that didn't have as much firepower as the starfighter collection and required more crew, more resources, etc., etc. That was my logic. It could easily have ended up being either way in the actual setting, but I was trying to build Starfighter war setting. So
you see, yeah,
and sometimes things get a bit here and there to fit the setting the setting in the story I'm trying to tell.
Yeah, it's a universe building, isn't it? It's building the universe.
And
it is fun.
It is fun, and it's complicated, and it's got all kinds of moving pieces that interlink to each other. As I tell people when I'm doing actual writing presentations, it's story feeds technology, feeds setting, feeds culture, feeds economics, feeds story, feeds characters, feeds story, feeds culture, it's all interlinked. My usual trinity is setting, technology, and story, or themes probably is an easy substitute for story, but all of it feeds into each other. And one of the things that I'm try to be careful with is the conflicts are resolved with the on the established playing field. Like if there's changes to the playing field of what's going to happen, and conflicts aren't won by super weapons or fancy toys or some ship that can do something no other ship can do as a rule. They're going to be won by people bringing the same ships they had at the start of the book to the battle at the end of the book and doing something clever with them. It's very rarely going to be a super weapon that turns the tide of things. Unless that super weapon's name is Damien Montgomery.
Yeah. Oh, mate, there's a certain I'm trying to remember his name now. Certain Admiral in the Peacekeepers of Seoul series now, who's very effective, and he turned up at one point just when he was needed with some extra ships, which just appeared to be in service. And I'd say that was a fairly useful super weapon. Turning up a whole fleet of ships activated from reserve. Very useful to have an admiral like that who's
3 days late.
Yeah, 3 days late, but turned up when everyone was going, we don't have any more ships. Hello? They've just come out of reserve. No one's quite sure how they got here. They got here. That's all that's required.
I am very fond of what someone called the left princess and his friends scene in Raven's Hope.
Mm-hmm.
That one definitely was a lot of fun to write and lived in my head for some months before I wrote it. And when you get to whatever hells are awaiting you, you tell the Watchers in Shadow that we may die, but until we die, our guard endures. Editing slightly to minimize spoilers.
It's a good scene. There are some very, very good scenes in that. Although there was part of me which started reading this going, and I'm not going to take too much credit for this, but I'm going to take a little bit of credit. Reading some of the things you got destroyers doing, thinking, you have read my book about tribals. Yeah, you've read some of the books about what destroyer crews got up to in World War II, and you've gone, yeah, they're going to do that in space too, and they would.
I think it might be Starship's Mage, where I have a captain complaining about the steady diet of raw meat we're feeding our cruiser commanders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's the type of people you need in certain roles. You need your destroyer captains to be willing to take insane risks to do their jobs, whether that is to protect a bigger ship or to hunt down a bigger ship, depending on the context.
Yeah.
And then you need your cruiser captains to be willing to go throw everything at the wall and take the risk of because your cruiser captains are the ones you're sending out independently. So they're the ones who need to be willing to take the risk of being formally disavowed by their nation to do the right thing, to do what they think is needed. Your destroyer captains need to be the ones who will, I don't know, in deep space, fly next to a black hole to ambush somebody. But your cruiser captains need to be the ones who will put themselves between a not current enemy and enemy's warships and a not current enemy civilian ships and say, no, you move.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, you can kill me, but if you do, you're going to war with my boss. And you don't want to go to war with my boss.
And the thing is, especially in a space setting, especially in some of the settings where you're further away and people can't, they are going to know you by your actions and your nation's actions long before they know you. And if you set yourself up as this standard of this is what we stand for, you've got a chance.
I need to find it.
It's one of those fundamentals of naval diplomacy and naval presence mission is that you are known as much by your actions and by what you do as your words.
Yep.
And it's valuable.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find a particular quote.
I know. Although sometimes, by the way, you do make the wrong decision and then you're in trouble. Or as one, this is the thing: is how old do you think the saying "deep doo doo" is?
I'm not sure. Early 20th century.
I found it from a Royal Navy cruiser captain in a letter in 1890s.
Nice.
He reckoned he was going to be in deep doo-doo.
the quote I have in the original Space Carrier book about you judge on your actions and your honor.
Mm.
There may yet come a day, Admiral, when the Federation must break its words to its allies from necessity, but it is not today. And until that day, our honor, our oath, is part of the glue that binds this alliance together. In all honesty, I think we can afford to lose one obsolete carrier far better than we can afford to lose that honor.
Yeah. It's the same reason as why Cunningham goes to Crete to evacuate the British Army.
The evacuation will continue.
You can afford to lose ships far more than you can afford to lose the faith of the army and the Royal Navy's willingness to evacuate you.
Yep. And it's one of the things that comes back to bite really badly coming back to bite the villain in the House Adamant series.
Mm.
He made the strategic decision to abandon one of the 6 planet systems of their kingdom and abandon a significant chunk of their army on the surface of it to fall back and fall back home and return with home fleet. It was the strategically correct decision. It won the war. Except his sister stole the credit for actually coming back. So he bears the burden and the reputational burden of having abandoned the army, where she got the credit of actually coming back to save them, even though the whole thing was his plan, and most people are intellectually aware of that. But the army never forgives him.
No.
And when he tries to take power over the course of the series, it's one of his biggest problems is he can't actually rely on the Royal Army. Because he made a choice that was the correct military decision, but the wrong decision for faith and honor between the 2 senior services.
Yeah. The army's never going to trust you off that. And to be honest, the Navy's also going to question your judgment, because if you can make such a decision about a third of the army, how easily could you abandon a portion of the Navy?
Yep. It's not going to bite. It's already biting him in the ass. It's pretty much explicitly already biting him in the books. So.
The trouble is, the only thing you could really do in that situation, especially you can get away with it to an extent if you're a general, if you're just a general. But if you're a monarch or a member of the royal family, and it's that sort of scenario, your only thing you can really do is, I will go down to the service and wait with the army, send them the fleet back to get the other fleet.
Oh.
Because that's the only way you can get away. You can go, I'm making the strategically sensible decision, but I'm not abandoning my troops.
Yep.
And that would earn you kudos. But that also is taking a very big leap of personal judgment.
Yeah. His argument was that it was to make sure that it was that the reinforcements came, that they needed the king's brother to stand there and go, we have to relieve this planet. Because it's like to get the political will to strip home fleet and expose the core system, they needed the monarch and the monarch's brother standing there in front of everyone going, this has to happen. That was his judgment. He may have even been correct in that, but that doesn't change the reputational cost for him.
And I will be devil's advocate here and give the argument against it, which I'm sure you do, which is, however, if he'd been standing on that planet and had sent the note back with the fleet, it would have been, come save me, I'm here.
Yep.
And I'm the king's brother.
Yep.
In which case, my brother, if I have anything like a decent relationship with him, or if it was my sister, for example, then if anyone tried to stop that fleet being sent to if anyone had been trying to stop that fleet coming towards me to come and get me, there would have been war.
Yeah.
As I know my sister.
One of the oddities of future things is in a bunch of my settings, king is gender neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the king in this case was King Valeria, the main character in the series, his mother. Both of them. Not that the second one is main character yet. That's 2 books away.
This might be coming from the scenario I come from with Britain in that our queens who have ruled have used that title very, very well.
Yeah.
It's almost part of me which thinks that Queen's almost a stronger title in the UK, especially thanks to Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria, than King in some regards. I sometimes think Queen is actually the more respected title.
It is still so weird to me to see anything about His Majesty or the King.
Yeah. Because it's been the Queen, and it was the Queen for so long.
It's the Queen for my entire life. It's the Queen for my parents' entire life.
it's still weird. Well, I got new money the other day, which has the king's head on it. I finally got some coins which have the king's head on it because I use coins so rarely, and it's a case of
Yep.
that's weird.
The last time I got new coinage, I actually specifically special ordered it because it was the memorial toonie for Queen Elizabeth's passing.
Mhm.
And I think, and it's not the only coin in the house, but that one is actually like in a little display thing.
Yeah.
I specifically got the memorial toonie. And yeah, it's interesting building the settings, especially the ones around the ones that have royal houses, because you're not going to get away, I think, outside of some really interesting situations in the future, setting up anything remotely resembling, ultimate monarchical authority.
No.
You're going, excuse me, you're going to have a lot more of the I reign, I don't rule type of symbol and so forth. But you might have, and then you are going to end up with ones where there is a balance where they were looking for that longer term offset. The Adamant system actually has two people that are the equivalent of the presidential veto. One is the monarch, the other one is the prime minister. And they can actually veto each other. The monarch has a great deal of power in that system, but their power is not unlimited. And politics feed into the fleet situation always, because warships are expensive and they're not going to be any cheaper when you're talking about something that can travel between star systems.
It's going to take a long time to build.
Yeah. I mean, we are looking at most likely. Frankly, I consider the ability to self-assemble warships from nanites actually a more likely future postulation than faster than light travel. So you'll note which one is actually present in all of my books and which one isn't. The stuff I write is designed to tell a story, not actually be a real prediction of the future. There is some stuff we're playing around with in science for faster than light travel, but nothing solid enough for me to think it's actually going to happen. But it exists in all of my settings because that's what makes for the type of stories I'm trying to tell.
Although it's kind of interesting the idea of trying to build a war fleet around generational ships. It's kind of a sort of a scenario of going of I can't see you could actually run a warship which was a generational ship. You'd have to have hypersleep something.
There's a series I'm trying to remember the name of. Yeah, the Legacy. No, God. Ian Douglas wrote a trilogy of trilogies, or William H. Keyes writing as Ian Douglas. Did a trilogy of trilogies around the United States Marine Corps with not necessarily generational ships, but relativistic ships where they were it was taking them 10, 12 years, like 8 years subjective to get to the wormhole they needed to get to fight the war.
Mhm.
And he did some really interesting things with like what that caused in terms of culture shock. There was at least one part of it where you had a Marine expeditionary force that came back 30 years later to find that not one but two world wars had been fought in their absence, and that the country that had sent them out no longer existed, except as part of an aggregate entity. And I don't think you really see the generation ships, though. You're right. You do see some of the relativistic ship things and some of the cryo-freeze style things, delivering forces that are being shipped over decade-long journeys. But I don't think you really see the generation ships. That would be like how you would have basically no way of guaranteeing that the third generation would have any interest in the mission you launched them on.
No.
Like even the most dedicated of indoctrination, I don't see how you could do it. Humans are humans.
No, they turn up and it's why are we fighting this? Why are we doing this?
Hi, we got sent here to fight you guys, but we're not really interested and we can't go home. Can we cut a deal?
Yeah. It's a problematic. It's a whole scenario where you can't really do that with generator. Hypers sleeping. If you can make the people dormant and they'll still be alive when they
Yeah.
get there and still in fighting condition and not slip their entire lives away. Yeah, if you could put them in some sort of cryostasis, great.
Maybe. Yeah.
But that's going to be one of those things of it's probably going to take them months to get into cryostasis, and then once they wake up, it's going to take months to get out of it and years to reach back to their peak at their training. Because the nice way, you're not going to tell me there's not going to be some wastage of muscle mass and body while
Oh yeah, you're basically firing them off and then you're waking them up at least a year, probably 2 years before they actually reach the target. Because otherwise, if nothing else, you'd be ridiculously vulnerable for that final approach. But even with that, if they know you're coming, intercepting those ships where everyone's in cryostasis is easy.
Yeah,
it's one of the things that I point out is even assuming faster than light travel or hand waving that away, or even let's just go with a war between Earth and Mars. It's just not actually practical considering that you have to lift everything out of one gravity well and drop it into another gravity well. And the person you're attacking doesn't have to do either of those things. You would basically end up with you would need such a overwhelming preponderance of resources to wage even an interplanetary conflict that your only real option is the practical breach, where you have basically an agreement that rather than engaging in weapons of mass destruction bombardment of the surface, once you are in control of orbit, the planet is expected to surrender. Because otherwise, your only real option to take control is to just bomb cities until they give in. Because you can't bring enough soldiers from one planet to another to subjugate an entire planet.
Unless you're manufacturing those soldiers in orbit, i.e. clones or drones.
Yeah. And as a science fiction writer, I poke at and examine and think about all of the problems. And a lot of them really are insurmountable. Like, a lot of them are. I don't actually expect to see grand space battles of massive war fleets because the economics and the logic don't add up. Now, humans are humans, and things will happen. But the good news about the stuff I write is that it's actually really unlikely. Unfortunately, the bad news is that might mean that our futures will not be as, progressive and diverse as I like to write.
Well, to be fair, I would also say that the other problem is the universe is, as we know, as we currently understand it, infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And the trouble with an infinite universe is that means there's infinite chance for us to be wrong.
Agreed. Yeah. And that's the other thing is I am as much of an amateur futurist as I am an amateur historian by the nature of what I do. And any attempt to predict the future is wrong. I used to do forecasts, planning, analysis, budgets, and such like that for our companies. And the thing that I always had to remind people of, the model is wrong. It doesn't matter how accurate the input is or how much work I put into refining it. The model is wrong. It physically cannot be correct. It is a tool for judgment calls and guidance. It is not a crystal ball. It cannot be perfect. No prediction that anyone makes is perfect.
Yeah.
And while my stories are about entertainment, there's themes and depth and other things to them. But I recognize that there's a lot of insurmountable issues and problems with space travel and space war and all of this that I just sort of hand wave away, because that's not overcoming those is not part of the story I'm setting out to tell. Like, I'm currently putting together an adventure series around a giant monopolistic mega corporation and a freighter crew in it. And I actually had to think for a little bit over what they would be using for gravity. And at the end of the day, I went, you know what? They have artificial gravity. It doesn't make sense. Not necessarily, but it's not something I really want to get into the details of in the story. So I'm going to brush over that. because it's not relevant to the story I'm trying to tell.
Hmm.
And it's not like the Castle Federation series where how they get artificial gravity is inextricably intermingled with how their ships move, how their ships fight, how their ships travel left. All of that is all tied into like the one Minovsky particle, I think is the TV tropes thing. There's just this one piece of unobtainium that allows all of this to work. It's not really set up the same way in the settings. So. Because of the nature of it being sort of civilian cargo, a lot more of that tech stuff will just get brushed over. Because, they're not the military engineer. They don't need to know.
They just need it to work.
Yeah. He's a freighter captain.
Although, conversely, I will say this about my experience with civilian.
My assumption is honestly the freighter
crews.
captain understands the engine very, very well.
Yeah. they usually know exactly what they're talking about. But the thing is, they will know their ship inside and out. They won't necessarily know the system of the science or the theory, but they will know their own ship. They will know what makes it tick, what makes it work. They will know it.
Exactly.
They'll be able to tell by just its sound, going, "Oh, that's off."
Yep. That's valve 16, deck 4. Go fix it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's when you sort of go, "Oh, you really have worked on this ship for a long time, Chief, haven't you?" Yeah. They know their stuff. Stuff.
Yeah.
But no, it always sort of, it's a whole thing when you're building these fleets, when you're building this sort of those worlds, is deciding. So the interesting thing, the thing that also comes back is you've got to work out how these ships are going to relate to the planets, how they're going to get to and from the planets.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like. So it's a case that sometimes it's the it's one of the fun things is when you're talking about the stories from Star Trek, the shields and transporters all come about because they want to save money in filming. The shields come about because they don't want to they want to be able to add drama, but they don't want to keep blowing up the set because that causes issues and have to rebuild the set. And transporters come about because they don't want to keep filming episodes in the shuttles because that's expensive and it adds you require to set to that.
Yeah, they didn't want to build a shuttle in the first series.
You of course don't have those issues. No.
A lot of shuttles.
But no, a lot of shuttles. Because it seems to me that you sort of you don't. I'm trying to think who did the books. Yeah, transporter-like things are not something you usually go to.
I don't think outside of Starship's Mage, where they are cheating, it is literally magic. I do not have anything transporter-esque in any of my books.
That's what I was saying. You don't usually go to. I haven't read and I will put my hands up and say the Starship's Mage. I have read one book of. I found it enjoyable, but it's not really my type of science fiction. I'd say I'm far more Peacekeepers of the Soul, Castle Federation, those sort of things. That's more my sort of my area. And I'm honest about this, but I did go and read because I know how popular the books are, and I know how much you love that series and after the writing and so. And so that's what I was sort of thinking of going. That's the only series I can sort of think of where they have something like transporter-like, and yes, it does literally use magic.
Yeah,
but again, that brings in level. How do you go about designing the shuttles and deciding what you want from the shuttles? Because the thing I've noticed is that they're not. You don't design them so that they automatically can do everything you want. No. There usually is a compromise going on there.
Most of my settings operate on basically there's two types of shuttle: heavy cargo lift and personnel. Usually assault shuttles as well. They're sort of halfway in between, but a specialist third thing. But your heavy cargo shuttles are designed to be able to land on a planet and leave a planet with thousands of tons of cargo. These are not things you want to be anywhere. These are not things you want landing or taking off anywhere near anything you would like to keep. Not using, Orion drives, but that's still a lot of energy that's going down into beneath them. So they're coming through. They're going to be coming in and going out through specialty sites, so away from your cities, or preferably they don't come down to the surface at all, and you're doing a lot of your stuff through a beanstalk, an orbital elevator. But your personnel shuttles, they're carrying 10, 20, maybe 30 people. They're much smaller. You can probably have them. They've probably got a certain degree of wings and lift. They would be space planes, almost certainly. where the difference that would make wouldn't be practical in a heavy lift shuttle. Depending on the scale of heavy lift shuttle, like I said, it varies from setting to setting. But your standard personnel shuttle is probably landing like a plane and taking off like a plane and then blasting off into orbit. And then your assault shuttle is sort of halfway in between. It's bigger than a personnel shuttle. It's got a lot more mass because it's carrying armor and guns of its own, where your personnel shuttle and your cargo shuttle outside of some specific military operations are probably completely unarmed. Your military will probably stick some defensive stuff on the cargo shuttles, but might not, because in theory, very few of those are going to be trying to land in a contested environment. Or if they are landing in a contested environment, you're covering them with assault shuttles.
You're covering with everything you can get because they are big, expensive, and slow.
Yes. And then your personnel shuttles are your standard motor, the equivalent of your motor launch. They're just dropping from orbit to a planet and vice versa. And that kind of defines a lot of your things. It's one of the things I find lacking especially in TV, because they don't really have the budgets for the Enterprise when you do start seeing shuttles in Star Trek to have two shuttles, is you have them, we're picking up supplies for the Enterprise, and it's this shuttle that's the size of a bus, and the Enterprise is the size of a cruise liner. You are not fitting a useful amount of supplies for the Enterprise in the space shuttles we see the Enterprise have.
No.
And that's where kind of that heavy lift shuttle concept comes in, because that's a second type of ship that is picking up all of those big cargo containers and such like. Because of my background being in economics and accounting, I put a lot of thought into that side of things. Most of my stuff have some futurized equivalent of the TEU, the 20-foot equivalent unit, which it's usually the 10-meter equivalent unit, which is 10 meters by 10 meters by 100 meters, which is 10,000 cubic meters, and if you fill it with water, is 10,000 tons.
Mm-hmm.
And given some of the things with space, you might be filling it with water more often than you'd think.
Yeah. Because, of course, heat dissipation is always a fun thing. Working out that one. People associate space with retaining heat, but also you need to dissipate heat from the engines.
Yeah.
From system and some sort.
There's a sequence in one of my books where the characters are like, what do you mean we actually have to worry about creating heat? The main reactors aren't on. We don't have fuel for the main reactors. Therefore, there is no heat on this. The only heat on this ship is a couple of radioactive thermal decay plants and the humans. That's not actually enough.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone on the ship is actually quite thrown by this because they're so used to the heat dissipation being their primary concern. Because 99.9% of the time on a spaceship, you're far more concerned about getting rid of heat than creating it.
It's a whole scenario. It's a whole scenario to work through. It truly is. I'd say with the shuttle ones, especially when you add in fighters and all the other things, I always think they're less likely to have weapons in a scenario where you have fighters present. But if you don't have fighters, I can see it's more likely they're going to have weapons, because you can't deploy the fighters down to defend them.
Yeah. In settings that don't have fighters, it ends up being a second role of the assault shuttles.
Mm-hmm.
Or you end up with you have the modular combat shuttles from House Adamant, where the shuttle is, you have one sort of engine and control pod that, depending on what you attach to it, is either a fighter, a bomber, a personnel shuttle, or a heavy cargo shuttle.
Mm-hmm.
Though I do note in there that for every squadron of like 8 of these shuttles, they only actually have one module to be a heavy cargo lift shuttle. Because it's really big, that module.
And because they probably don't need more than one most of the time.
Yep.
Although I'd probably be tempted to say, in a nice way, if I was the commander of that scenario of a game, can I have a second one boxed up somewhere in a crate?
Well, I mean, if you only had one squadron of shuttles on your ship, I guarantee you have a spare heavy lift shuttle pod. If you've got 3 squadrons on your ship, you've got 3 heavy lift pods anyway, so you don't worry about it as much.
Yeah.
But you probably have a personnel pod, an interceptor pod, and a shuttle pod for all of your, I think I call them the cubes for the Adamant ones.
Because you might need to do a lot of troop transport, a lot of movement of personnel.
You might need to drop an entire company of troops. You might need to cover. You might need to send a full 18 bomber strike out to take out something a very long way away, or you might need every scrap of defensive firepower you can get around your ship.
Mhm. Which is historically accurate.
Yep.
Yeah,
The situation,
so
it's like the situation at the end of the first House Adamant book. It's like, what do you are being chased by a vastly superior warship. Do you equip all of your shuttles for defense to try and keep that big ship from killing you, or do you mount them all as bombers to try and kill that big ship with a golden BB?
Mhm.
Or do you do something ridiculously risky, stupid, and clever and pull a rabbit out of your hat?
I'll give you a clue, everyone. With Glynn's books, it's usually the latter, but it's usually very well written in such a way that it doesn't look like it's pulling a rabbit out of your hat.
Describe one of the characters had the problem as he described it. When we're looking to you to pull a rabbit out of a hat, we're not sure if the horribly clashing colors on the hat are a problem or part of the plan.
Yeah.
When you have someone you're looking to provide the clever out of the box idea, they might be doing something that you think is risky and wrong, but half of the things that they do that work are also risky and wrong.
It's
No
that's
problem.
kind of that's the kind of the history, because you have characters in navies, Cochrane, Vian, to name a
Mm.
couple from the British side, you know, personnel who literally were looked at by senior officers as, this person is a pain in my. They are absolutely certifiable. But when I need someone to do something absolutely insane and make it work,
Yep,
they're
this is the
who I
person we
call.
sent. Yep.
And you do. The thing is, that's a good thing about having a solid ship design, because they can use that to work with. Whereas if it's a case of, it goes sound strange, but it's always more believable for me, especially considering human history and our experience with ship design, that it's going to be the person pulling it at rabbit out of the hat with a solid ship design than them doing it because they've got one special ship which is being produced.
Yeah. No, I run into that in a few books I've been reading recently where this ship is to everything else what Dreadnought was. I'm like, so everyone else is building one, just hasn't deployed it yet, right?
Yeah, that's the point. It's the kind of like HMS Warrior. People forget that the Royal Navy, the really impressive thing, was under the French had launched Gloire and the Royal Navy so quickly responded Warrior, is that they responded with Warrior and Black Prince.
Yeah.
And that's your real trouble if you're relying on the ship being, this is going to be the super vessel which is going to dominate the
Mhm.
space. Yeah, the odds are someone else is going to build one very quickly.
Yeah.
It's a dreadnought race. It's a naval race. The dreadnought itself is part of the naval race, which had already been going on for quite a while.
Like where you end up with real tech disparity in a setting is kind of there are three pieces to it because I have some pretty significant tech disparities in several of my settings. One is just straight up time and distance. Like what is developed in place A, Seoul, isn't really going to be replicated in place B, that's 1,100 light years from Seoul, 3 years travel, anytime soon. Just
No.
the distance means it doesn't dissipate as quickly. The second one is communication speed, which is kind of a factor of the first one. But if you've got instantaneous communication, it's a lot easier for that stuff to spread. The other one is simply economics. It's like when you've got the economic disparity between the United States and, well, let's say even Canada.
Hmm.
Canada's not building, much as I have occasional, joking fantasies, nuclear-powered icebreaker carriers to secure the Arctic. Does Canada?
Before anyone thinks that Glynn here is joking, that he actually does have a whole icebreaker battleship book, which is excellent to read, by the way. Excellent to read.
But there is a very real argument that it would serve Canada's interests very well to have, given Alex's usual thing about capabilities, 3 or 4 nuclear-powered armored icebreakers that could act as, basically the equivalent of the Japanese helicopter destroyers or the LHDs. Could launch F-35s and fighters. And if we had three or four of those in commission, we could maintain one in the Arctic at all times, and that would be extremely useful for Canada's interests in securing its northern borders. Even if there was the political will for a project like that, which there isn't, and if Canada's military acquisitions were not a horrendous dystopian Kafkaesque nightmare, which they are, Canada does not have the resources to build such ships. We do theoretically have the technology.
Yeah.
Canada is still, despite a lot of jerking around and stupidity, one of the world leaders in nuclear power.
Yes.
And we have shipbuilding and we build icebreakers. We could build a big nuclear powered icebreaker carrier, but we couldn't afford it.
No.
And so you have our southern neighbor, who literally across the border we have pretty much full military tech sharing with, could. They won't, because they'd rather build a general bigger carrier that could do 500 other jobs. But the economic disparity between your core powers and your fringe powers in most of my settings is even more dramatic than that. I think in Scattered Stars, I described the core system, Redward, as taking place as like a ninth rate power by the standards of the galaxy. And by the standards of their region, they're a first rate power. But by the standards of the overall universe, they're nothing. And so they're really technologically behind compared to what larger powers in towards the central worlds are like. And then your last piece is a far more dedicated, to really get sort of sharp divides, you end up with groups that are actively seeking to maintain that divide, up to and including blowing up other people's labs. Which is what you see in House Adamant, where you have the Technology Import-Export Commission that is quite prepared to kill people to protect the technological superiority of the United Worlds. They're very polite about it because the United Worlds is very, very upfront about their ideals on the surface.
Yes.
But they have maintained a lot of their technological and political and economic supremacy by some very underhanded deep things.
Again, it's right out of the human playbook.
Oh, yeah. The Pax Americana was great if you were on our side of it, but it was not pretty or clean.
No. And let's be honest, Pax Britannica was much the same as was Pax Romanus. It's always the same for the most powerful empire. That's the cost of doing business. That's the cost of being of trying to stay in charge and trying to stay powerful.
And it's like, I'll be blunt and say the Pax Americana was probably better than the Pax Britannicus, and the Pax Britannica was probably better than the Pax Romana. But none of them. But those are low bars to clear.
Yeah, that's not a high bar to clear. But there again, it's also a case of this is the problem you sometimes get is, what is their purpose? Was their purpose to look after the world or to look after the peoples that they were responsible for?
Yeah,
and that's it.
Yeah,
and
it's
that's their job.
We are judging them, and as I say this, I am judging them by a cost that is not relevant to the purposes of those three structures.
Because their purpose was not about world peace and world happiness. It was about how do we survive? How do our people thrive? That's what we care about.
Yep.
And sometimes it's the interesting conversation is when you have
all three had some level of idealism around world peace baked into them. I think even the Romans.
Well, the Romans' idea was mainly world peace by Roman domination.
Yes. The Roman concept of world peace was everyone has a place in the hierarchy and we're at the top. And so long as everyone else accepts their place in the hierarchy, they will be peaceful and prosperous under our rule.
Yeah, and their idea was to Romanize the world, basically.
Yeah.
They wanted everyone to be wearing togas. What can I say? They were very, very firm fashionistas. It was very firm fashionista. And I don't think a toga really suits the UK, and I definitely don't think it would suit Canada as a practical living wear, but they were very keen on everyone wearing togas.
Yeah, it would be very cold here. There's definitely some togas are in the last two Starships Mage books on a very cold and very windy planet and everyone who is not from the planet is looking at the locals wearing them, and they're like, I am very clearly misunderstanding how that garment is set up, because if it's an actual toga, it would be over there and not still on you.
It's a case of, are you wearing a tunic underneath your toga? Well, I would be. I'm not sure about everyone else.
How is the toga tied and what is it made of? These are mysteries they don't disclose to outsiders.
It's like
what's under the Scotsman's kilt?
Yeah.
You don't ask.
I don't. Definitely. Not my family, they'd show you. Not really, but they would. So, here's the thing. I've been asking my questions and popping but is there sort of anything you think you'd like to be asked? Anything you've you not asked, but you think people should ask when they're sort of thinking about these things? Because I can imagine this video could be watched by some people who are thinking about writing as their own science fiction setting, etc. And what are the things that don't get asked about shipbuilding and the ship design that you think should be asked? Or they should be thinking about, but you don't see many people thinking about.
Thing, you have to think about it. A lot of people don't, and like, much love to many of the other people writing in my genre, but it's quite clear that a lot of people are running off a surface level of what they read in someone else's book, and I mean fiction book.
Mm-hmm.
And that will get you a certain distance depending on the book you're trying to write. It will. But you have to stop and think about it. You don't need to know all of the details. You don't need to go into it in the level that I do even. But you need to think about what it is, what it's structured, and how it ties into everything else. The flip side is you don't need to know all the details. Again, much love to several of the people I know working in my field, but they will delve into massive amounts of detail and in the background. For some people, that's what they need to. They need to know the what's underwater to write the tip of the iceberg. But you kind of need to know how much of that underwater do you need is the thing when you're writing it. My books are an ice floe, not an iceberg. There's stuff underwater that I'm not putting in the books, but it's not that deep. I know I am building a lot of the detail as I need it, but like I said earlier, I know the framework. And so for me, I draw the frameworks and the structures in broad brushes and then fill in all of the details as I continue writing the books in the series. Other people need to have all of those details and such to be able to write it at all. And it's very easy to get lost in the world building. Mm-hmm. So I don't recommend it myself. I really don't recommend getting lost in the world building. You have to find, as with most things in writing, you have to find what works for you. It's always going to be a question of experimenting and finding what level works for you. I personally feel like reading a lot of history is a really good way to learn about the past and to get story ideas and those sorts of things. Like I don't duplicate. David Drake was both an excellent writer and an amazing human being. May he rest in peace. I met him a few times, but he was quite explicit that a lot of his stories were straight up retellings of historical events in space. Like he would actually, at the end of his book, there'd be an author's note explaining which historical battle the book was based on. I would not really recommend doing that. I don't think many of us are good enough to do what David Drake did in that way. But reading through those events gives you ideas and stories and things to draw from. And it tells you how people think. Fiction won't teach you how people think. It can't. Authors will do their best to write books where people think the way people think, but a fictional character is always stuck in certain patterns. There's a limit to how much they can be. They're not real. And you can't learn how real people think by reading the thoughts and actions of someone who isn't real. Mm-hmm. But reading the actions and the words of people who are real can give you a far better feeling of how people think. So reading through history and events and these things is how you get that feel for how soldiers and merchants and captains and sailors and all these, how they approached problems, how they thought about problems. I'm reading a book right now about the experience of what was the life experience from basically birth to death, I believe, of a soldier in the Middle Roman Republic. And that's the sort of thing that really gives you a sense of what people are and what they think. And again, and how culture feeds into that. Like, there's 2 chapters in this book on what is Roman culture and how does that shape what this person becomes before they ever join the legions.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about the culture and the history and the traditions of the British Navy, and those were critical to how British officers thought and fought. And when you're looking at the stuff you're building, your fleets, it's not just a question of where are they from and what is their culture and what are their traditions, but how old are those cultures? How old are those traditions? How much weight do they have? These are things you can draw at a very broad brush that tell you a lot. And if you use them right, they can add depth and weight to your book and to your setting without you having to put a lot of work into it. You put together the right framework and a lot of the pieces start to fall into place without you needing to do a lot of work. But as with anything in writing, you have to experiment and find what is the right depth of framework that you need to pull it off.
That's always true, especially even with history writing when you're putting history together. And I was sort of it's interesting having you bring up Romans because, of course, like the second episode of Two Historians was with Simon Elliott. I haven't introduced you to, but next time you come to the UK, I'll try and make sure you have a bump into him because I think you'll like him. Mm-hmm. He basically specialized in the Roman navies and what they got up to, the classes, things like Classus Britannicus and the other navies. And he would tell you that the interesting thing for him is that the Romans really don't differentiate between ranks or service at sea and service on land. Mm-hmm. They consider it one and the same. And of course, in their structure, they could find themselves commanding a flotilla. They could find themselves commanding a fleet. They could find themselves commanding a legion as they're going up the honor.
Cursus honorum. God, I can never. It's the cursus honorum. Yeah,
the cursus honorum, and it's a really interesting thing when you think about it like that, and you think about the scenarios of. Well, for the Romans, the fleet was always a necessity because, let's be honest, their empire was the Mediterranean Empire. Yep. The Mediterranean was their internal lines of communication. It was how they moved the goods back and forwards, and add in rivers, add in where they put the forts on rivers and all the things. Mm-hmm. Waterborne transport is critical for moving heavy goods, for moving large volume goods. As you say, supplies for ships, etc. And you start to realize that. Quite a lot of the Roman policy on how they're logistically organizing things and how they're putting things together is probably going to still be true in space.
Yes.
Because the thing, you think about it, they're deciding where they're putting their forts and their positions together by where they can logistically reach most easily.
Yep. And in space, especially, one of the things that you need to factor in, and I'm bad at brushing over this, but it is always there in my books, is logistics. Because you can't forage in space.
Wasn't that very good Rear Admiral who decided to, magically get those extra ships? Wasn't he a logistician of some kind?
Yes, logistics branch.
Yeah, I thought so.
The 2 things I tend to poke at with logistics in space because they lead to interesting story opportunities is to my mind, you probably don't want to send out an interstellar ship that can't break down an asteroid and build most of its own spare parts.
Yes.
I actually talked in one of my books about one of the fleets actually knew off the engineer for the ship knew off the top of her head the time to replicate for their ship. How long it would take them if they were trapped in a star system to build a complete copy of their own ship with just the resources on board. And it was about 50% longer than it would take to build the ship in a proper shipyard, partially because they probably would have actually been building a proper shipyard. But they had the fabrication capability aboard the ship to build almost anything they needed. It just took a long time. The other one is recycling water and food. No one really wants to think about that too hard. And I brought in a couple of times about the problem wasn't that they couldn't recycle their food forever. The problem was that when they started having to go onto recycled ration bars, morale cratered because no one was in any illusions about what the recycled ration bars they were eating were.
Oh no. Let's be honest, the ration bars in their original format are bad enough, let alone recycled ration bars.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so you can recycle a lot of things, but even the best recycling, you have loss. You're going to lose water. You're going to lose, and obviously, fuel is one of the things you can, depending on your ship and how you're functioning, pick up along the way. But you're going to find that food and water are your big restrictions because you're not going to be able to grow. No matter what you do, you can't grow food on a warship, not at enough quantity to make a difference.
no.
So one of the things you'll find, I suspect we'll find, is that a long-range space deployment might well end up being limited as much by food as anything else. It'll be defined by the need to stop every so often and collect water and fuel, but it'll be restricted by your ability to get food. If you're not operating in a region of space where there's local allies who could, even if you're operating in a region of space where you have local allies, if they don't have food that is safe for you to eat because they're not human, that doesn't actually improve your supply chain.
No.
On key limitations.
No, it's submarine rules again, isn't it? It's a case of, yes, we have a nuclear reactor. We are therefore functionally infinite time underwater. Other than whilst we can generate drinking water, we will run out of food. And eventually...
you'll go insane.
Yeah.
Your limitations are going to be food and the ability of your crew to be trapped in a tin can forever.
Yes, you need to find... The interesting thing comes up, and it's one of the things navies have been dealing with functioning for a long time, is that humans, as much as they like to be in groups, they also like alone time. And you have to figure out ways for them to have it. And it's like, I remember someone was massively critiquing the Galaxy class and the accommodations they have for the crew aboard there in terms of Star Trek. That's right. Actually, to an extent, that makes sense.
5-year mission.
Yeah. You need your own space. And let's be honest, on the side when you're building something of that scale, the amount of space you're going to need to add on to have things of that space for the crew, it's not really going to add on much. And honestly, if you stick them around on the outside of your ship, then worst comes to worst, they're kind of the sacrificial bits that, enemy weapons have got in and they have managed to blow up, some crew accommodations. We're so sorry about your stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. We're so sorry you lost your stuff. We'll apologize. We'll compensate for you for this. By the way, because it just was going into crew accommodations, it didn't get any further into the ship.
You might have lost your picture of your dog, but you didn't lose your dog, who was, 3 blocks further in.
Yes. Although that's going to be another fun thing, taking pets with you. That is going to be a fun thing.
It's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah.
I suspect that because our things are what they are, we will almost certainly end up accidentally taking rats to space with us, which means we will probably end up taking cats to space with us. And, certain small dogs.
Well, you've got corgis in space, on at least one of your books.
Yeah, tradition, because you leaned on me.
Yeah, and although...
And Zebediah leaned on me.
Although Zebedee's still annoyed that they weren't able to be used as crack troops to do an assault, he feels that the corgis would have done the assault very well. He feels you tell the corgis that the enemy are hiding food, and they will have taken that station before you. Oh, Zebedee does a nice line of leaning on people. He does. But no, thank you for this. It's been a lot of fun. I don't think there's any more we should probably have to probably need to carry on because we'll just start repeating ourselves. But thank you for this, and I feel do have a lot of questions for Glynn. The one good thing about Glynn is sort of that A, he's usually able for me to track down so I can ask him questions, but also B, I'll get him back again if people would like to hear more from him. And as said, all things hopeful, you'll join us in Japan for the ship-shaped trip in Japan.
That's currently the plan.
Yeah.
There was some muttering in my direction about once-in-a-lifetime opportunities and not giving them up from my partners, so...
That's always a good thing. That is a good thing. It's going to be there are some really fun things being organized for that. There are some really strange things being organized for that. But yeah, Japan. If we pull off Japan and the ship-shaped trip, the stuff we will get from there for putting up on YouTube and stuff for people to see is going to be spectacular. But the things we're going to get to see as well. Although I think there is so much for me to organize. Even though it's organized, there's still so much for me to organize.
I know the
I love
last
it.
trip I took with you guys onto the ships in the Buffalo
Yeah.
was really useful for me in a lot of ways. And the timing meant I got some real insight into damage control too, which was fascinating as well.
Yeah, we were of course Buffalo, and that was a really good one because we got to do a live from inside the destroyer, the Sullivan's, and basically clear up a lot of issues for them they were having with what was being reported about what had happened to them. And thanks to Drac and us being able to do a live from inside the Sullivans with the people, and it was quite a fun one because, and it felt like it was an important one doing it, but I still remember the guy he was a bit nervous about doing it, and basically me and Drac just stood either side of him and said, "Don't worry, it'll be fine. No one will be saying anything. We know no one will say anything rude to you, but don't worry. If anyone does, we're standing either side of you. They're going to have to get through us, and we're used to this." And that was, yeah, that felt like we were doing good that day. That was also the day we, of course, went and tried the original buffalo wings.
Yep. And I got sick, but that's pretty normal for me eating in restaurants.
We're hopefully going to do a better job in Japan. We're going to hopefully do a better job in Japan, and we do quite a good job usually when you come to the UK.
Yeah. I am at least easier to feed than my partner. You could just have me live on sushi. I'll be fine.
And you're easier to feed than my sister, who, unfortunately for her, is dairy and gluten-free. In terms of allergies, if you want to see someone with Botox, you give her one of them, and it looks like she's had Botox. Anyway,
I think your sister and my wife are on about the same page.
Yeah. I don't know. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. I'm going to say thank you to Glynn. And if any books coming out that you want to plug
on Amazon, if you can spell my first name Glynn, you can find my books.
Luckily, I will leave it in the screen, so people should be able to do it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Now, normally I do a shameless book plug at the end of these videos. I'm not doing that today. I'm doing this is what we've got coming up plug. And what have we got coming up? Well, this Two Historians came out on Wednesday, the 11th of December, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. It's after the second part of So You Want to Build an Aircraft Carrier, and I hope you enjoyed that as well. Now, there's a reason this video got the Two Historians on the Monday got replaced by HMS Cosplaying to make sure that was delivered. But don't worry, there are more Two Historians coming, and I'll be recording even more this week, and I'll be recording even more and more, hopefully, as Christmas goes on. And I'm hoping on the 20th of December to do a joint Twitch stream with Garius, the Brit, where we'll be playing Hearts of Iron 4. So, yeah, wish me luck for that. If I'm playing against him, I will probably be dying in a hail of fire because he's a much better 8-hour 4 player than I will ever be. But, yes, wish me luck for that. Wish me luck. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Thank you very much for supporting the channel, for sharing the channel, joining the channel, for subscribing, for super chatting, super thanks, all those things. Thank you. It all makes a massive difference. This channel, my research and this channel, entirely funded by you. And thank you for that, because without you, it wouldn't be possible to continue doing this all. Take care, and thank you.